full implementation of the Knesset legislation will be disastrous. In Gaza, undermining UNRWA's operation will compromise the international humanitarian response. It will degrade the capacity of the United Nations just when humanitarian assistance must be scaled up significantly. This will only worsen the already catastrophic living condition of millions of Palestinians.
That was UNRWA Chief Philippe Lazzarini speaking to the UN Security Council on Tuesday in a last-ditch effort to try and stop Israel from shutting down the UN agency's operations in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. But Mr. Lazzarini's pleas and the pleas of countless voices from the humanitarian sector, the international community, world leaders, governments in the East and the West have failed to stop Israel's ban. On Thursday, the agency was forced to close down its offices in occupied East Jerusalem under direct Israeli orders. During that UN Security Council session, Israel insisted that the ban would not be reversed, and the US actually backed Israel's, quote, sovereign decision, saying that UNRWA is not the only provider of aid to Palestinians. But UNRWA is the largest and most effective distributor of humanitarian aid and other services to Palestinians. In East Jerusalem, it runs 12 facilities that provide critical public services, including schools where more than 1,200 children are enrolled, and free clinics that serve over 70,000 people. But the impact of the ban would actually extend beyond just Jerusalem. Across the West Bank, UNRWA runs 40 primary healthcare service centers, and 47,000 children go to UNRWA schools. In Gaza, where the catastrophe is unimaginable, up to 1 million people relied on UNRWA shelters during the war at some point, and more than 300,000 children of school age rely on the agency for their education. The ban on UNRWA's activities became official after the Israeli Knesset passed 2 bills in October last year. One that stops UNRWA's operations in Israel and East Jerusalem, and the other that prevents the Israeli government from interacting with the agency. The legislation essentially disrupts the organization's finances and operations and comes after Israel accused UNRWA staff of taking part in Hamas's attack on October 7, 2023. Israel also directed other allegations against the UN of, quote, justifying terror and of being anti-Semitic and biased. UNRWA has repeatedly said it will continue to do its work until it can no longer do so, but it fears that the ban will have far-reaching consequences. The war in Gaza has already been the deadliest conflict for UN staff alone, where more than 270 UNRWA employees have been killed. Now that the ban is in effect, what will happen next? This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. In this episode, we look at the toll that the ban will have on Palestinians who have never been in greater need of humanitarian assistance, especially in Gaza. We ask what this means for UNRWA as an agency and what options it will have at its disposal to adapt and deliver life-saving assistance. UNRWA was established in 1949 to provide relief to 700,000 Palestinians who were expelled from their land in what is called the Nakba, or catastrophe. After the Arab-Israeli War in 1967, Israel and UNRWA signed a treaty, which now expires under this ban. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has said that there is no alternative for UNRWA. And now, 76 years since its inception, it's hard to imagine what or who could fill its void. I'm joined by Tamara Al-Rifai, Director of External Relations and Communications at UNRWA, to discuss the ban. We've known for a while that this UNRWA ban is going to take place now, but with the timing of the ceasefire, organizations like UNRWA are going to be so desperately needed. Can you tell us about the impact that this ban has had on aid, schooling, education, and even the economy in Gaza specifically, but also in the West Bank?
We are the largest humanitarian agency in Gaza. UNRWA has played really the biggest role during the last excruciating 15 months. It's the one that has received the largest amount of humanitarian assistance. It is the UN agency that has the largest infrastructure in Gaza, whether it's trucks, warehouses, or shelters. But beyond that, UNRWA has been a full network of schools, health centers, social workers. I mean, Gaza is very much UNRWA in the sense that most of the Gaza population, over 70%, are originally Palestine refugees. So they came to Gaza as refugees decades ago. and since then have relied on UNRWA in various ways, whether it's their kids going to schools, UNRWA schools, whether it's getting vaccinated in UNRWA health centers. So UNRWA is very much a fixture in Gaza. Now, UNRWA also employs 17,000 people in Gaza and the West Bank. UNRWA is the second largest employer after the Palestinian Authority. So a large part of the Palestinian economy also relies on Gaza, with so many households directly receiving salaries and their extended families also being helped by the people who are employed by UNRWA. This is how it works. And therefore, if that legislation is applied across the occupied Palestinian territory, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, the impact is going to be disastrous from a humanitarian perspective, mostly related to the current humanitarian response in Gaza, especially since the ceasefire started. But the consequences are going to also be disastrous for the tens of thousands of students in UNRWA schools across the OPT. So the impact is going to be really, really disastrous.
Tamara, the Israeli legislation that was passed actually prevents Israel from communicating with UNRWA. How will this disrupt the agency's work going forward?
For instance, international staff will no longer be able to apply for visas. And if we do not have official Israeli visas, then international staff cannot go into Israel and from there onto the West Bank or Gaza. If we have no contact policy, then UNRWA will not be able to coordinate the entry of humanitarian supplies, the passage of trucks onto Gaza. Likewise, we will not be able to send in other types of supplies that are needed, for example, books and stationery for a resumption of learning in Gaza. Any activity by UNRWA that requires that we go through an Israeli checkpoint or a border crossing will no longer be possible if there is a no contact policy. We will not be able to apply for any permits. There is a mechanism called deconfliction, whereby an aid agency receives some kind of safety guarantees. We will not be able to coordinate a safe passage of our trucks.
Before the ban actually came into effect, what communication or instructions did UNRWA receive at all from Israel? What actions were you requested to take?
UNRWA's offices are in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah in occupied East Jerusalem. So for anyone who has been to East Jerusalem, the UNRWA headquarters is nestled between, on the one side, settlements, buildings, housing units, and on the other side, residences of Palestinians. This is really prime real estate in East Jerusalem. A few days ago, on the 24th of January, the government of Israel sent a letter to the UN Secretary General, and I quote, requiring UNRWA to cease its operations in Jerusalem and evacuate all premises in which it operates by the 30th of January. We had seen in the last few months statements by Israeli officials saying that the UNRWA compound will be transformed into settlement, illegal settlements, 1,440 housing units.
Can you talk to me about the logistical undoings that need to be done for UNRWA to stop operating in the occupied Palestinian territories in East Jerusalem and in Gaza? What would it entail logistically?
There has not been details about how the laws are going to be implemented in the rest of the West Bank and in Gaza. The international staff of UNRWA that is posted in East Jerusalem has all been granted limited visa periods. So all the visas of international staff posted to East Jerusalem for all our West Bank operations, all these visas expire by the 29th of January. And so UNRWA has had to take a really painful decision to ask the staff whose visa expires to leave the country. And we have protested to the Israeli government. Now, this is an eviction of international civil servants. This is an eviction of UN personnel. And this is an act by the government of Israel that contravenes Israel's obligations under international law. Having said that, our Palestinian colleagues, UNRWA staff themselves, will remain and will continue to run our services. They're going to be doing that within an exceptionally hostile environment. If anything happens to our Palestinian staff and UNRWA no longer has access to Israeli officials, then it's going to be very difficult for us as a UN agency to protect our staff.
So we've seen UNRWA staff stay behind in the north of Gaza in the middle of Israel's war, its siege and starvation of the people of northern Gaza. Palestinian staff of UNRWA in Gaza have refused to leave and chose instead to remain behind and carry out whatever little work they could at the time, which all of this comes at a high cost, right? So what will happen to UNRWA staff in Gaza under this ban?
UNRWA staff in Gaza paid an extremely high price for their commitment to continuing to serve the community, their community. Our Palestinian staff, for most, are Palestinian refugees themselves. So they know about the plight of Palestinian refugees, and they know what UNRWA means to Palestinians. In Gaza, we have tragically lost 273 UNRWA staff members. This is really UNRWA only. It's very, very painful for us to live with having lost all these colleagues. Because we have to remember, UNRWA staff are Gaza population as well. So they've been displaced, they've lost loved ones, they've lost their homes, they've lived in shelters and in tents and on the street themselves. So their own ability to come to work has been inconsistent, but they have remained extremely committed. Since the ceasefire, they are the ones who have distributed the content of over 1,000 UNRWA trucks carrying essential humanitarian aid. These are the teams that have reached more than 500,000 people with food and supplies. These are the teams that have collected more than 3,000 tons of solid waste. And that is why, for us, our commitment towards the community remains. And our Palestinian staff have been the backbone of the humanitarian response. Even at the height of the war in Gaza, UNRWA's health teams have continued to go around the Gaza Strip. We were able to give over 7 million health consultations across the Gaza Strip since the beginning of the war. We drove the polio vaccination campaign along with the World Health Organization and UNICEF. We continued giving reproductive health services to pregnant women throughout the conflict. So I know that the image of UNRWA during this conflict is mostly an image of food parcels, shelters, but in reality, we've also continued to offer some kind of learning to children in the shelters. We've offered mental health and psychosocial support to people in Gaza, and we have continued our health services.
Is there a way for UNRWA or the international community to reverse the Knesset's legislation at this point?
UNRWA is a UN agency. The UN is part of what we call the multilateral system. This multilateral system has been extremely mobilized in support of UNRWA since the beginning of the war. So We have seen the different UN agencies speak in support of UNRWA. We have also seen the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice about the situation in Gaza. And recently, the International Court of Justice has also been looking into the illegality of this latest attempt by the government of Israel to prevent a UN agency from working. Now, what needs to be done? That is up to UN member states to decide what more instruments they have in order not to create a precedent. Here, I really need to insist on the precedent that's being created, whereby one UN member state is challenging that multilateral system. One UN member state challenging the UN by banning a UN agency. This is really dangerous because if this is set as a precedent, then we can easily slip into a trend where any government that doesn't agree with the role, the mandate, or the values that are promoted by a UN agency may decide, well, I don't like this UN agency. I want to undo it. I want to dismantle it. I want to remove it. Then what kind of system will we all be defending?
What is the alternative solution? Is Israel, under international law, obligated to offer an alternative solution? Or could UNRWA's activities somehow be merged into the activities of other UN agencies?
We have not been in any contact with the government of Israel. The government of Israel has not communicated directly with UNRWA for months now. And so we did not go into a conversation with the government of Israel about alternatives. Israel, as an occupying power, has the obligation to provide basic services to the population that is being occupied. Now, if UNRWA ceases to exist, Israel must provide schools, healthcare, social protection, and other services across the OPT. Another UN agency cannot do that. There is no other UN agency that runs a full-fledged primary healthcare system with clinics, with mobile health teams, with doctors and nurses. No other UN agency has teachers, educators, and the know-how and the human resources, or the money for that matter, to run a full-fledged school system. It's important to remember that UNRWA was created as a temporary solution in 1949, and that the idea was that UNRWA would provide emergency services to those who were forcibly displaced between 1946 and 1948. Now, if there's a political solution that includes the future of Palestine refugees and that they can access primary healthcare and education, then there will be no need for UNRWA. So the claim by the government of Israel that UNRWA perpetuates the status of Palestine refugees is disingenuous, because UNRWA wishes nothing more than a political solution that includes a solution for Palestine refugees so that UNRWA can phase out its services. But absent that, UNRWA provides these services.
That's it for Beyond the Headlines this week. We follow this and more on thenationalnews.com as more developments come to light on UNRWA, Israel, Gaza, Palestine, and the wider region. This episode was produced by Ban Barqawi and audio engineered by Arthur Edison. Yasmin Al-Taji is our assistant producer and Dua Farid is our editor, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next Friday.